Hi, welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews, episode 22. We are diving right into it today. Jeremy from Virginia asks, what is it about kitschy stuff that makes it so psychologically appealing to us? Why do old people love to collect little figurines of the sort that you see at thrift stores?
Well, Jeremy from Virginia, let me start off by saying this old person does not collect kitschy tchotchke stuff, but I'm going to consider your question to have two parts and then ignore the first one. One is people who obsessively, compulsively hold on to stuff like that, and maybe at some point we can talk about hoarding psychiatric disorders, but instead focusing in on your pointing out the collecting stuff as you get older, which maybe I could generalize more as why do we take more comfort with familiar things as we get older? And it turns out this is something I've actually been thinking about for a while. I actually did a really quasi-science study on this years ago that got published in this journal called The New Yorker. And what I had been noting was I was getting incredibly close to novelty, which is to say I realized 90% of the time what I was listening to with music was the same, like Bob Marley greatest hits, just over and over. And while most people would have a realization like that as something that would make you do some reflecting and painful introspection and things, as a scientist, what you do is sublimate that into a scientific study. So what I did was, first I called up 50 radio stations randomly selected across the United States and that played music. And I asked their station master, programming master, whatever, what's the average age of the music that they play? And what's the average age of their listeners? And then I called up 50 sushi restaurants in the American Midwest. And this was at a time when sushi was still kind of exotic. Whereas now I assume that when like the Ku Klux Klan is having an organizational meeting, they cater it with sushi. But it was kind of exotic at the time. So I found places in the Midwest and 50 of them and asked the same question. When did sushi first get offered by your restaurant, and what's the average age of your non-Asian clientele? And then finally, I called up 50 body piercing parlors in San Francisco and Manhattan and asked, when did you first start offering tongue studs and genital rings and things like that? And what's the average age of the person who comes in for that? And you do a whole bunch of statistical analyses on it. And what you get is the answer that by age 25, if there's a type of music you are not yet listening to voluntarily, there's a 95% chance you will never do that. By like age 32, if there's a type of food you've never tried, that's 95% chance you're never going. By age 18, if you have not gotten a tongue stud or a genital ring or whatever, 95% chance you never will. Your window of openness to that sort of novelty is closed. So I thought this was very cool. And then I discovered all I'd been doing was reinventing the wheel, because like people have been studying this for a long time and documented all sorts of highly creative people. Their creativity decreases as they get older, fewer measures of music composed by composers, fewer lines of poetry. Obviously, all sorts of exceptions. Matisse invented a whole new style of art in his 80s. Beethoven did 32 piano sonatas, and his very final one, I think, is like one of the most radical pieces of music. But in general, highly creative people become less creative as the years go by. In addition, highly creative people become less open to somebody else's novelty as they get older. And examples of this, there was a guy at my grad school, a grand old man of cell biology named Alfred Mirsky, who in his old age, all this guy is ever going to be remembered for is he was the last credible scientist on Earth who said DNA can't possibly be the material of inheritance, of heredity. Einstein spent his last years doing a regard action against quantum mechanics. Martin Luther spent his later years crushing every logical, peasant uprising that was spurred by his own young revolutionary stuff. So this is like a common pattern. People becoming less open to novelty, less searching for it, and less open to somebody else's. Okay, so what is this about? It turns out neurobiology teaches us less to nothing about this, because for one thing, despite like urban legend stuff, we don't lose massive amounts of neurons as we get older. Moreover, there's no novelty part of the brain, let alone subparts novelty for new types of music or food or whatever. That doesn't give us much insight. A psychologist, a guy named Dean Simonton at UC Davis, has done some really interesting stuff looking at highly creative people getting less open to novelty, less open to somebody else's novelty as they get older. And he noted something, which is it was not your chronological age. It was your disciplinary age. The longer these people had been in this discipline, the more they close to somebody else's novelty. Key point with that, the more they had been in that discipline, the longer it had been since they had been doing something new. People who changed careers started the clock again on their openness to novelty. Then he got an even more interesting sort of subtlety with that. It was not just the more years you had been in your discipline as a highly creative person. The key variable was the killer. The killer on being open to novelty is becoming eminent. Because all eminence can do is mean that you and your buddies are going to be knocked out of the textbooks by whatever new has come along. It's the eminence that comes with having been in a field for a long time. Okay, so that's great, but it's not being eminent that's really playing a role in why we're listening to oldies radio stations or whatever. Another psychological component is peer identification, which is, you're an adolescent when you're trying out tongue studs or inventing, molecular biology or whatever. And what you're heavily into is all you're trying to do is communicate to the world is everyone who has come before you, especially your parents' generation, there's no resemblance to you and your peers. And it's this notion that it then lasts. You form peer identifications early in life. And if this music was good enough when we were at Woodstock in the 60s, or when we were taking cocaine in Studio 54 in the 80s, or when we were on PlayStation in the 2000s or whatever, that's good enough for me to still be holding on to that decades later. So you get this sort of peer identification thing. People are willing to die or kill for group identification. They certainly should be willing to listen to lousy music and insist that that's the best music that was ever written. So that's great. All that's interesting, but it doesn't explain one really interesting facet of all of this, which, as a biologist, is at the top of the list. You see the same thing in animals. As animals get older, they are less willing to try new foods. And this has been shown in all artificial studies, a troop of baboons that was captured because habitat degradation moved to an entirely new place, which had a lot of new plants. Nobody other than a young adult or adolescent ever tried any of the new plants, and it went downward as to who to try it. Famous cases, Japanese macaque monkey named Emo, who invented some new food types, and nobody older than her ever tried it. Lab studies with novel foods. It's the exact, as animals get older, they get close to novelty. And that's sure not because these cows are unwilling to try out sushi because of their peer identification stuff. So there's something very biological about it. But somewhere along the way, thinking about it, it struck me that I was actually asking the wrong question, which is not, why is it that we close to novelty as we get older? Why is it that familiarity and repetition become so soothing and so comforting? And some of it has a certain adult sort of logic. I mean, at some point, we hopefully come to terms with the fact that, among other things, we only have a finite number of restaurant dinners left. So why take a chance with something you don't know about yet and you may turn out not to like. So go for the familiar, whatever, as the clock is ticking away. But I think psychologically, the why do we like repetition and familiarity more as we get older is because in some ways what the aging process is about is everything underfoot turns to quicksand. So the familiar gives you at least some vestiges of solid ground to stand on. And there's this great anecdote. Stravinsky, he was on his deathbed in the hospital and his wife was there and he had like this ring and apparently he kept rapping on the railing of his hospital bed over and over. And finally his wife gets like irritated with him. He's on his deathbed, he's dying there. And she's yelling at him saying, "Why are you doing that? Why do you keep banging your ring there like that? You know I'm still here." And he said, "I'm doing it to make sure I'm still here." I think it's kind of something like that going on.
All right. So Jenny from Utah asks, what can you tell us about skin picking disorder, formerly known as dermatillomania? So this question actually kind of hits home for me. I struggle with a similar disorder called trichotillomania, which I'll get back to, but this felt like an appropriate one to bring up here.
Well, dermatillomania, trichotillomania, which I have some elements of when I have particularly anxious periods. This is part of a whole family of these obsessively picking at skin, obsessively pulling at hair, obsessively biting of lips, biting of cheeks, biting of tongues, obsessive picking of nose, picking of ears, obsessive clearing out stuff in your this part of your eyes or whatever. These are collectively known as body-focused repetitive behaviors. And it's a whole psychiatric class of disorders, and they're ones that can be absolutely ruinous of quality of life. Some of the time it's actually anchored in something else medical. You got a rash or whatever. Some of the time it's kind of a subset of worrying about hygiene stuff. But the characteristic of these behavior-focused repetitive behaviors is not only are they often unconscious, you don't even know that you're doing it, but at times when you are conscious, it's kind of pleasurable. It's not anxiety reducing. It kind of is comforting. It's a positive thing rather than a lessening of a negative thing. Okay, so immediately what this suggests is this a type of anxiety? Is this a type of OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder? First off, right off the bat, despite what people used to think in the psychiatry business, OCD is no longer considered a type of an anxiety disorder. It's considered to be some sort of cousin of it. Why is it? Lots of reasons, but one of the most pressing ones is an anxiety disorder. Yeah, you're going for a job interview. You feel anxious. Yeah, you're giving a public speech. Yeah, you're thinking about, do you have a serious illness, whatever. And these are grounds where it is natural to feel anxious. And what anxiety disorders are often about is just exaggerations, exacerbations of these reasonable ones to a point where it's really impacting your quality of life. And what OCD is so often about is instead motoric stuff, worries that are just not in the worry that you are going to spontaneously blurt out something wildly offensive, the worry that you're suddenly going to strike the person sitting next to you at the opera, the worry that something unnamably dreadful is going to happen if you don't have the silverware being symmetrical. It's just in a weird realm of stuff that is weird enough that it gets into a separate category. OCD is a cousin of anxiety disorders, is no longer considered a subset. Okay, so are body-focused repetitive behaviors a subtype of OCD? And the consensus is it's classified as OCD related, along with, harking back to the first question, things like hoarding disorders, things of that sort, that it's a cousin of it. Again, why is that the case? Because the thing about OCD is it's often anchored in the obsessive thoughts, produces compulsive motoric things to reduce the anxiety. This is something that's been explored by the Yale psychiatrist Christopher Pittenger, who sort of points out a key differentiating thing is there's little that is pleasurable about the motoric stereotypies of OCD. It's to reduce the dis-ease. Whereas the stuff with the compulsive is either it's unconscious and not related to a specific anxiety, or it's actively, consciously pleasurable. And in this regard, I think what it may ultimately be about is something fairly natural that has just kind of gotten out of control. You look at a bunch of baboons, you look at a bunch of virtually any sort of primates, and what an individual does is they frequently self-groom to like get some gunk out of themselves there. And what you'll see is you'll also have social grooming, and people have actually done studies, say looking at baboons when they're socially grooming, they are likely to be grooming parts of the body that individuals can't get to with their own self-grooming. Imagine spending 5 years in your thesis keeping track of what body parts. And social grooming is getting a whole exploitative, high-ranking baboons do not groom other individuals, other ones do it to them. But it's also doing something psychological. Which is like you have a whole troop of baboons and they have a close call with a lion or something. And what happens afterward? They all sit down and they groom each other for 20 minutes, a soothing sort of thing, a collective social soothing. On the other hand, you get a baboon who individually is prone towards anxiety, and here comes the scariest baboon of the whole troop. And what does our anxious guy do? Suddenly, this is the most important spot of crud, imaginary crud in his fur, a self-grooming, self-soothing sort of thing built around anxiety. And I think there's some roots of it in there in terms of roots of decreasing dis-ease, but also elements of the pleasurable, all of that. Okay, so how about the more reductive biology? It runs in families. There's genetic components to it. There's this gene SAPAP3 that was identified recently. If you knock out the gene in mice, you get obsessive self-grooming, a bunch of other obsessive things there, and you find variants of that gene are associated with body focus, repetitive behaviors and such. And it turns out it's got something to do with the neurotransmitter glutamate. That's just a hint there. It's got something to do with a part of the brain called the striatum, which has to do with repetitive, habitual, motoric stuff that can be pleasurable. So there's some hints there. One of the things that really emphasizes why these repetitive body-focused things are not a subset of OCD is one of the most effective drugs for OCD are SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and SSRIs, as they do with depression, are like first-line meds that are used. And it turns out that even though it's the most prescribed medication for people with these body-focused, or the actual science shows it doesn't work. And it makes some sense with that. SSRIs are about making thoughts less sticky, less viscous. In the case of depression, it makes negative, sad ruminations less sticky, less viscous, and you just get caught in that. In the case of OCD, it makes the something dreadful is going to happen unless the fork and spoon are absolutely symmetrical. It makes that less sticky. And that's not what these are about. They're not being driven by this sense of dread. That's something I've got to focus on this. It's just, you just kind of do this uncontrollably, or you'll notice this feels kind of, or whatever version of it that's happening. That's another measure of why it's in a different subclass. Interesting hint about a different neurochemical domain that may be relevant to this sort of stuff. This neurotransmitter called GABA. Okay, forgive me for 30 seconds of like jargon here. GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. It is modulated by a class of drugs that people are given that are called benzodiazepines, like Valium and Librium, anxiety reducers. And what they do is they potentiate the effects of GABA, all of that. And there's sort of this business, there's receptors for drugs like Valium and Librium. We did not evolve to have receptors for a best-selling drug. What that tells you is somewhere in your body are endogenous benzodiazepines, which people have been trying to make sense of for years and years without a whole lot of progress. But people have developed drugs that will block benzodiazepine receptors, will block the effect of your endogenous tranquilizing neurochemical, whatever that is. And years ago, I did this study with the baboons where I took this benzodiazepine receptor blocker, a class of things called beta carbolines, and you dart a baboon with it, and you do it right, where the person, your assistant, your field assistant, either they fill the syringe up with saline or with the drug and hands it to you, and you don't know which is which, and then you dart a baboon, and the beta carbolines kick in after about 10 minutes and last for about 10 minutes, and about 10 minutes into it, suddenly the baboons are looking around anxiously. Suddenly they're doing this. Suddenly they're picking between their toes, whatever. Suddenly they're pulling up grass, and 4 minutes later it passes. What was interesting was if you were a low-ranking baboon, you had a more dramatic response to blocking your benzodiazepine receptors. So that's probably part of the story, a whole different neurochemical system. Take-home message, it's not OCD, it's not an anxiety disorder, but it's a cousin of. Nobody really knows how it works yet. And once again, kind of this theme, some sort of naturalistic roots to this stuff that have just gone awry in a genetically vulnerable subset of individuals.
Yeah. Just to reiterate, it's not fun. It can be pretty debilitating. Yeah, as I said, in my case, I struggle with trichotillomania, which is the hair pulling version of it. For me, that's for eyelashes and eyebrows. It started late high school, as if high school isn't already hard enough. I've been super lucky that I have a support system where we've sort of come up with our own method with it, where when they see me doing it, they'll snap, literally snap. And we've trained me with that. And when I went to college, I had a couple close friends who I let in on that method as well. I have a little shock bracelet that I use on myself sometimes when I'm going through phases of having more picking. If you're struggling with it, as much as you can, find people who you feel comfortable sharing that with, I guess. And it helps a lot.
So 2 punchlines there. If you're struggling with virtually any neuropsychiatric disorder, social support is incredibly important. And if any of this sounds familiar, the other punchline here is you're not alone. And it's biology turning on you. It's not some sort of personality failure or something.
On that note, that is it for episode 22. As always, keep submitting your questions at the form found in the Instagram story highlight and bio or the YouTube video description. I'm Offspring Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of Science and the Beard.